Hello, I am Dr. Takkara Brunson, and I am an Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M University, College Station. The lecture that I am giving will focus on women's public roles during Reconstruction. I'd like to begin on April 3rd of 1866. That day, Black residents of Richmond, Virginia gathered to celebrate Evacuation Day on the one-year anniversary of the city's surrender to Union forces. The event included a parade of formerly enslaved men and women who celebrated their freedom. Despite threats from many white residents and the burning of the Second African Baptist Church days prior, an estimated 1,000 to 1,500 Black men marched down the city streets with them. Many wore military uniforms and carried muskets. More than 15,000 spectators gathered to cheer them on. Within 2 weeks, members of the Ladies Memorial Association, a group organized by white women in Richmond at the close of the Civil War, called for the establishment of new association chapters throughout the state. They would go on to initiate dozens of chapters throughout the South as well. Each Ladies Memorial Association chapter raised funds to tend to the graves of Confederate soldiers. Their efforts contradicted African American celebrations of the war's end. Instead, they emphasized the tragic sacrifices made by their male family members. The ladies relied on beliefs that women were political. Thus, they avoided the charges of treason that their male family members would have confronted had they organized similar events. My goal for this lecture is to examine how women responded to the end of the Civil War. We know that ideas of citizenship were radically transformed with the abolition of slavery and the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Yet women would continue to demand legal rights that included suffrage. At the same time, the activities of the Ladies Memorial Association, or as I will also refer to it as the LMA, demonstrate that women helped shape post-war efforts to build a unified nation. I am going to discuss their efforts alongside those of suffragists and Black women laundresses in Mississippi in order to think about how women challenged established social hierarchies during the period. I will use these groups to emphasize that women responded in differing ways that reflected their personal backgrounds and priorities. So historians note that elite white women in southern states like Virginia entered into a period of mourning at the close of the Civil War. Many women, when they would leave their houses, dressed in mourning dresses to call attention to their sadness regarding the loss of the Confederacy. And here I feature one such mourning dress. You'll note the dark, heavy fabric that they would wear. Some women also, when they left their house wearing these mourning dresses, would wear at least one, sometimes multiple veils, similar to those that they would have worn at a funeral, right? That's while men begrudgingly accepted defeat as public figures. Women used clothing as a way to challenge the federal government, including the presence of Union soldiers in states like Virginia. Another factor that led to the formation of the Ladies Memorial Association involved the Confederate soldiers. This included women offering food and aid to Confederate soldiers who were traveling home from Union prisons. So many men, following the close of the war, would have received transportation back to the general region in which they had been captured or in which they had resided prior to the war, but many still had to travel miles to arrive home, and thus these women helped to support them, providing them with food and aid, right? Women eventually shifted their focus to honoring fallen Confederate soldiers, and this became a particularly tricky issue because the federal government had established national cemeteries to recover the bodies of Union soldiers, many of whom had been buried in shallow graves, and then would take them and rebury them in well-maintained cemeteries in states that included Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Virginia. In total, there were about 73 national cemeteries that were established during this period. White women who supported the Confederacy first sought to rebury fallen soldiers by providing them with a proper burial that would have been similar to what the federal government was doing for Union soldiers who they viewed as loyalists. But what happened is that oftentimes they still buried these soldiers in shallow graves that were later uprooted by animals or with the development of farming. Thus, they saw this as an affront to the sacrifices made by men on behalf of their country. Women later moved to commemorate the legacy of Confederate soldiers by fundraising for and organizing annual memorial events, right? And this later activity led to the establishment of the Ladies Memorial Association. Now, who were these women? Membership chapters were theoretically open to all women who sought to honor the Confederacy. In reality, most members were white women who came from elite households. So these were the wives and daughters of local politicians, business owners, merchants, doctors, lawyers, and so forth. And this class distinction is important. Historians like Caroline Janey have contended that the Ladies Memorial Association provided a way for elite white women to reassert their elite status. Thus, while prior to the war, their status was determined in part by their connection to either owning slaves or being associated with businesses that would have relied on slaves. After slavery, they asserted their status as these prominent women connected to this well-respected organization. Most of these women were also young, so they came of age around the time of the Civil War, and by the close of the war, would have been in their late 20s to early 30s. And as such, they developed a network of independent organizations that cooperated with each other, right? The way that they built their membership included circulating calls for women to form associations throughout Virginia and across the South by sending out mass mailings, as well as by publishing news ads and articles that called for women to tend to the graves of Confederate soldiers. The members also paid dues, which they used to host events, as well as to tend to the graves of soldiers in their communities. These efforts evolved to become elaborate annual events. For example, on May 10th of 1866, the Oakwood Memorial Association in Virginia held their first tribute in Richmond. Richmonders suspended businesses for the occasion, and more than 1,000 individuals gathered for religious services at St. John's Church in the city, where Patrick Henry had given his "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death" speech before marching in a procession to the Oakwood Cemetery. At the burial grounds, the participants scattered flowers on the 1,600 graves. They then listened to an appeal from the Reverend Manning that God might console and bless the wives of orphans of Confederate soldiers who had fallen in war. And then they organized a final speech by Raleigh E. Colston, which focused on the loyalty of the enlisted men to the, quote, lost cause. So clearly choosing to remember the close of the war in a way that differed from the federal government. This celebration concluded with more than 200 Confederate soldiers who saluted him with a rebel yell. Importantly, Richmonders who attended the event were quick to remind any Union supporter claims of treason by emphasizing that it was women who had organized the event, thus making it non-political. LMA chapters remained active in providing spaces to celebrate the Confederacy throughout the period of Reconstruction. However, by 1870, their significance began to wane as men claimed control over how the history of the Confederacy would be remembered and told. There are a few points I think are significant and that I want to briefly highlight, right? The first is that these women helped create a bond among mothers of the South, especially for those who had lost a loved one fighting for the Confederacy. Second, they shaped public perceptions of themselves, so creating a public reputation for themselves beyond their domestic roles. But they did so by drawing on an image of themselves as grieving surrogate mothers of fallen soldiers, which is interesting because many of these women did not actually lose sons or even family members in the war, but they witnessed the devastation caused by the Civil War, either by working in hospitals, witnessing battles that had come to their community, or just through word of mouth and the experiences of their family and friends. Thus, their efforts were symbolic in calling attention to the devastation that their communities faced. Equally important is that the Ladies Memorial Association members helped shape a sense of white Southern identity after the Civil War, And this is an identity that necessarily excluded African Americans as well as white Union supporters from the South. Now, on May 10th of 1866, the same day that the Oakwood Memorial Association in Virginia held its first tribute, suffragists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony gathered with other Northern women to work towards fashioning or forming the Equal Rights Association in New York. Both women began their fight for women's rights prior to the Civil War. Stanton was born in Johnstown, New York, in upstate New York in 1815. Her conservative father was a wealthy landowner and lawyer who served in the U.S. Congress and New York State Supreme Court. Her mother was more progressive politically. She supported the abolitionist movement and women's suffrage. Stanton received more formal training than most women of her era. She studied at Johnstown Academy. She desired to attend university, but no school in the area would accept women at the time. She later married abolitionist Henry Stanton in 1840. Subsequently, she became active in the abolitionist movement. Her frustration with women's marginalization in the anti-slavery movement, in which, for example, women were excluded from the World's Anti-Slavery Convention, led her to focus on women's rights. Stanton's friendship with abolitionist Lucretia Mott helped her develop her ideas. In 1848, the two women organized the first Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, also in New York State. Stanton's speech, the Declaration of Sentiments, expanded on the Declaration of Independence to include women alongside men. Her speech also called for social and legal changes to elevate women's place in society, including them having control over their income and property, as well as a woman's right to vote, and later gain custody over their children in the case of a divorce. Finally, she advocated for the abolition of slavery. Her partner, Susan B. Anthony, was born in Massachusetts in 1820. Anthony was raised as a Quaker. Her father was a farmer who owned and managed a cotton mill. Her mother descended from a family that fought in the American Revolution and served in the Massachusetts state government. Like Stanton, she adopted an idea of social equality from a young age. The main difference here was that Anthony's Quaker beliefs shaped her expectations of what women could achieve in society. Anthony later became a teacher. She moved to New York to join her family who had moved to the state, and there she met abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, both of whom were friends of her father. She began to give anti-slavery speeches herself that challenged ideas about what women of her class should be able to do in public. Stanton met Cady 2 years after the Women's Rights Convention. The women became collaborators who would work together for the next 50 years. And here is an image of the two women. Following the end of the Civil War, Stanton and Anthony would become two of the most prominent women's rights activists in the country. They believed that the cause of Black citizenship and women's citizenship were intertwined, and they worked alongside African American activists, both male and female, who were committed to addressing discrimination on the basis of race and sex. The federal government did not share these women's vision of citizenship, and indeed, Congress opted to grant Black men citizenship or voting rights well before women would receive the right to vote. In January of 1866, Cady and Stanton challenged the writing of the 15th Amendment by submitting a, quote, petition for universal suffrage, end quote. And that petition requested voting rights for all citizens, including women. They also later that year partnered with Black male activists to form the American Equal Rights Association, which again focused on achieving legal rights for all citizens regardless of race and sex. So they were broadly interested in civil rights that would include Black individuals as well as women, but they were most concerned about women receiving the right to vote so that they could help participate in shaping policy and laws in the country. Later on, they formed the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869 to advocate for a constitutional amendment that would grant women suffrage. And separately, another group of affiliated women formed the American Women's Suffrage Association that same year That organization focused on voting rights for women at the state level. Right? Of course, we know that women would continue to vote for fight for suffrage up until 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. But throughout much of this period, up until their deaths during the early 1900s, Katie and Anthony focused on circulating ideas about women's changing roles, always drawing attention back to the need for women's suffrage through newspapers that they published and other articles that they published in mainstream newspapers throughout the country. Now, it's important to emphasize how radical both women were in their activism. Certainly, their ideas challenged established views that women should not have control over their finances, children, or the ability to participate in politics. But the women's mere presence in public as writers, speakers, and even protesters challenged ideas about what was proper for women of their class. And indeed, on one occasion, Anthony was arrested for attempting to vote. She also risked arrest at some of the venues at which she gave speeches, especially offending people because she gave speeches in venues that featured both men and women. Many emphasized that women belonged in the home under the protection of their male caretakers rather than participating in public life, especially that which was related to politics. And indeed, what we see them demonstrating through their work, their writings, their organizing, their speeches, is that they saw themselves as the intellectual equals of men. The nature of their political activism, as well as their commitment to racial equality and political organizing alongside African Americans, certainly set them apart from the members of the Ladies Memorial Association. Yet certain decisions demonstrate how they too contributed to upholding racial ideologies of the time. For example, Black activists like the teacher and writer Frances Watkins Harper criticized white women of the American Equal Rights Association by accusing them of racist behavior. She determined that the women relied on stereotypes of African American men as seeking the vote to control white women's sexuality. And these were ideas promoted among Klansmen and many of their supporters who used stereotypes that Black men were a threat to public safety, in particular that if fully empowered that they would attack white women in order to justify lynching, segregation, and Black men's disenfranchisement. Some white women in the suffrage movement had also suggested in their writings that Black women learn how to be equal citizens from them rather than their own experiences or witnessing the experiences of Black men in the public realm. Finally, Harper criticized that white suffragists failed to advocate for reforms that would affect African American women in particular, and this included lower wages for their pay, threats of sexual violence, and stereotypes of their racial inferiority that circulated within popular culture. These tensions led to splits within the suffragist movement, with figures like Harper ultimately removing themselves from some of the mainstream feminist organizations of the time. Now, thus far, the women who I've described hailed from relatively elite backgrounds as the wives and children of wealthy families, as well as educated individuals, right? Some of them whom became literate, published, and gave speeches across the country. And here, I would consider Frances Watkins Harper elite. She was not from a wealthy family, but she was certainly born free in the city of Baltimore in Maryland, raised by her uncle after she was orphaned. Her uncle was a minister, and raised by his wife as well. They both ensured that she would be formally educated. Most women, however, lived in a state of financial precarity where they were semi-literate or illiterate, and Black women in particular confronted a range of challenges in navigating life after the Civil War. This included the risk of sexual violence when leaving the house, especially for women living in the South. It included the passage of Black codes in 1866 and onward that banned vagrancy, being idle in public, dictated how Black people were supposed to interact with white people in the community. Vagrancy laws in particular could be used to push women who had no desire to work into the workforce, oftentimes into agriculture, the same types of fields that they had worked in during enslavement. And those who violated Black codes could be then reincarcerated, as a number of Black men, women, and children were, and during that time would then be forced to perform free labor for white-owned households and businesses. Challenges that Black women also confronted included a lack of employment opportunities beyond agriculture and domestic work, as well as low wages and poor treatment in most of those positions. Now, this is not to suggest that Black women's lives were solely defined by their marginalization. In fact, in June of 1866, Black washerwomen of Jackson, Mississippi, submitted a petition to then Mayor Barrows. So really quickly, here is an image of Frances Watkins Harper. And then I draw your attention to an image of a group of Black washerwomen in the South, not necessarily Mississippi, but it gives you a sense of the types of settings in which they would have worked and their attire during the time. As the women began in their petition, "Sir, at a meeting of the colored washerwomen of the city on the evening of the 18th of June, the subject of raising the wages was considered, and owing to many circumstances, the following preamble and resolution were unanimously adopted. Whereas under the influence of the present high prices of all the necessaries of life and the attendant high rates of women, while our wages remain very much reduced, we, the washerwomen of the city of Jackson, state of Mississippi, thinking it impossible to live uprightly and honestly and laboring for the present day, daily and monthly recompense, hoping to meet with the support of all good citizens, join in adopting unanimously the following resolution. Be it resolved by the washerwomen of this city and country that on and after the foregoing date, we join in charging a uniform rate for our labor, that rate being in advance over the original price of the month or day, the statement of said price to be made public by printing the same, and anyone belonging to the class of washerwomen violating this shall be liable to a fine regulated by the class. We do not wish in the least to charge exorbitant prices, but desire to be able to live comfortably, if possible, from the fruits of our labor. We present the matter to your honor and hope you will not reject it as a condition of prices calling us to praise our wages. The prices charged are $1.50 per day for washing, $15 per month for family washing, $10 per month for single individuals. We ask you to consider the matter on our behalf, and should you deem it just and right, your sanction of the movement will be gratefully received. Yours very truly, the washerwomen of Jackson." With the submission of this petition, the washerwomen formed one of the first labor unions in the state of Mississippi. Not enough sources have been identified to determine what became of this organization. However, historians have noted that the women's actions inspired other male and female workers to organize in the state. Many of them were formerly enslaved individuals who sought to navigate the labor force as wage earners. The formation of the Washerwomen of Jackson preceded the establishment of the White Workers Union, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers in Water Valley, by 3 years. It also preceded the first interracial labor movement in the state by more than 20 years. In many cases, these African-American washerwomen and other domestic workers negotiated rates with former slaveholders who remained committed to upholding racial and class hierarchies. Their negotiations thus challenged their hierarchies. They organized in order to demand a living wage that would allow them to support themselves and their families, and such efforts became critical to living dignified, free lives in a post-slavery society. Indeed, one of the ongoing struggles of many African-American women would be to change how society perceived them. This photograph, which is my last image, helps us to think about their efforts. So I would like for you to take a moment to observe this picture. What do you notice about this image? How would you describe the clothing of the two women, their physical stance, their gaze, or where the women look? How does this photograph compare with that of the washerwomen, suffragists, and Ladies Memorial Association members? Both women in this photograph wear the attire of refined women of their time, a refinement typically reserved for elite white women, so the most privileged of women in society during this time. We see this in terms of their tailored clothing, jewelry, and other accessories that they wear, that their hair is styled to be pulled away from their faces, the strong posture in which they sit upright, as well as their placement inside of a photography studio. So unlike the previous image of the washerwomen that was captured with the women performing labor outdoors, here you have two women sitting in front of a backdrop that creates the outdoors, but that we all know is inside of a photography studio, and photographs during this period were still relatively expensive for the average person, regardless of race. Thus, as I conclude, I want to emphasize how each group of Black women, whether an educated figure like Harper or a laboring washerwoman in Mississippi, in some way often join their white counterparts in grappling with established gender and racial ideals during the Reconstruction era. This included challenging social hierarchies that were changing among the formerly enslaved and former slaveholders, among men and women, among Northerners and Southerners. Each group of women that I've briefly discussed challenged aspects of what we might describe as a dominant perception of society that excluded women from politics and legal equality while allowing for the economic exploitation of most workers, including African Americans. Finally, the multiple social positions that women held, determined by region, race, class, and political perspectives, led them to respond to changes of the Reconstruction era in varying ways. Each group played a key role in shaping the direction of life in the United States after the Civil War.